This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack. And if you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you're in the right place because we interview the brightest stars from all corners of the Pharmaverse. And today's guest would certainly fit that description. We're joined by Dave Latshaw, the CEO and co-founder of BioPhy. And he's going to be talking with us about AI's place in drug discovery. Dave Latshaw, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I was so impressed with your story and your leadership journey. And before we get into that, can you tell us just what you're cooking up there at BioPhy?
Definitely. So BioPhy as a whole is focused on creating a comprehensive platform for drug development post-discovery. I love discovery. I think it's really interesting. I especially like following all the artificial intelligence developments there simply because of my background, and I think it's got a lot of promise. But we like to make sure people understand that we are everything that comes after that. The reason being that I spent a lot of time at Johnson & Johnson prior to starting BioPhy, and I realized that there was basically an underserved proportion of pharma on the technology space that existed in that particular area. So we want to try to service that specifically because we think there's a lot of value creation there.
I spent some time on your website, and it really seems like AI is advancing, becoming more and more a part of all of our lives. But on the website, it differentiates between predictive AI and generative AI. Can you just quickly explain the difference?
Yes. So not to get too in the weeds here, but they're actually sort of the same thing. Generative AI is predictive AI. It's just when we see generative AI mentioned, people typically think of these large language models that have become popular post-ChatGPT. What those do are create text generation and many other types of modalities like images, video, things like that. But in order to create the next word that comes out, in order to create a piece of an image, they are just effectively predicting what should come next based on the information that's provided. So it's all really the same under the hood. It's statistics, it's math, and it always has been. It's not really magic. The magic is in how you think about applying it and the problems that you actually solve with it.
Like, for instance, generative AI, you put a question into ChatGPT and it generates an answer. That's generative. But then, like, if you're using Outlook and you start typing, I look forward to, and then it tells you, it tries to predict what you're going to say next. That's more predictive?
There's similar technologies before ChatGPT. If everybody sort of remembers back to the predict the next word on the cell phone, that's basically the precursor. That's effectively what ChatGPT is doing, just at a much larger and more efficient scale. Same idea.
I got to think, when you're at a dinner party and you tell people you're working with AI, you probably get flooded with questions. Like, one of the questions I got to think that is on a lot of people's minds is AI going to eliminate a lot of jobs? And now, with you working with AI all day, every day, what do you think about that?
It's funny that you mentioned that because somebody asked me that exact question just 2 days ago. There's been a lot of studies on the impact of artificial intelligence on the economy and different kind of corners of it in terms of where people are working. And the long and the short of it is that some jobs are going to get impacted significantly more than others. When it comes to the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, I'd say by and large, everybody is pretty safe. No need to really panic because the level of complexity that's dealt with and the sensitivity to making mistakes when you're dealing with human health and all the adjacencies are such high stake that you can't afford to completely hand over the keys to a model yet. They are not sufficiently capable of being accurate to the level where there would be no concern for the mistakes that they would make. When it comes to the people that are listening to this podcast, I think the best thing to do is think about how you can interface with them and use them in your day-to-day work, make yourself better, make yourself equipped, as opposed to worrying about it taking away the opportunities that you might have.
That's a great bit of advice. Someone told me, think of AI as an intern. The intern is not going to basically take your job, but it can really help your job do well. You're saying so interface with the AI, really get to know it, how to use it, how to make it help you make even a better impact in your job. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good that's a good metric to think about. You might have an intern who's new to the industry handle some tasks with you. Maybe you'd work alongside them for some things which are relatively low stakes, kind of get them familiar with the area that you're working in and those sorts of things. But it's highly unlikely that somebody's going to bring in an intern and say, decide whether or not we should submit this molecule to the FDA and leave the decision to them. So that's a very good metric for how to think about it.
Well, thank you. And as we relate to drug development today, in today's reality, how is AI being used?
It's pretty pervasive. So I would say that there's probably some form of implementation in almost every corner of pharma and biotech. The thing that varies is the level of maturity for those solutions. So when I say maturity, there's a few things that I mean there. Some of these technologies are very new, they're experimental, and they're kind of being used as a side-by-side for people who are doing the job on a day-to-day basis. Some of them are more highly integrated into a business process. Like, for example, you could get models validated to the level where they could be used in a filing with a regulatory body, but that's a pretty high hurdle, and there has to be a lot of confidence there. And that's pretty high on the maturity curve. So there's this variance, I guess, in how complex and how mature these things are. And that's sort of a byproduct of where a lot of the companies see the most value. That's where they're putting their efforts.
Thank you for sharing that. And if you think about, okay, that's today, predict. So predictive AI, predict what the future, maybe not the end game, because it's really hard to predict that, but maybe 5, 10 years from now, how could we be using AI in drug development?
Yeah, maybe I'll paint a little picture of how I think this is going to play out. Like I mentioned, I'm a big fan of artificial intelligence and drug discovery. There's a massive focus there. Every other headline is some splashy partnership or acquisition, related to a big pharma company partnering or buying an AI drug discovery company. Now, I don't think any single company is going to crack the code and have a magic printing press for molecules to address any disease they like. And a lot of companies will fail. Drug discovery is very difficult. Artificial intelligence is not a cure-all. The thing that will happen, though, is so much will be learned in that process that the productivity of discovering molecules and bringing them into development is going to be significantly higher. When that happens and that throughput is larger, the development process, post-discovery, like we're focused on, has to compensate. If you have more molecules and you have more opportunities, you have to have more people or more technology to be able to handle that volume. So that's kind of like the next bottleneck. So at this point, then, you've got artificial intelligence powering discovery. You've got it powering the development process through clinical trials and regulatory submissions. And there's a last piece, which is the regulators, because pharma and biotech companies don't operate without their say-so, especially when it comes to the commercialization of drugs. So sort of the last piece in the hierarchy there is the regulators. How are they actually using artificial intelligence as a complement to all of the individual companies to accelerate the process, to make it more thorough, and make everything ultimately more efficacious and safe for patients. So I think that that's sort of like the arc that we will see play out, and I can definitely see that happening over the next 5 to 10 years.
Fascinating. It brings up a lot of questions. First of all, you were talking about the acquisitions. There's a lot of these splashy acquisitions going on. Would you say that companies like big pharma companies are building their own AI platforms? Or are they looking to acquire it or just merely outsource it?
I would say I would feel comfortable saying there's not a pharmaceutical company on the planet who hasn't tried building something themselves. When there's a new technology arc, there's a lot of incentives to play the game and try to get ahead and create competitive advantage and everything along those lines, and to increase the efficacy of the company. By and large, what usually happens, unless there's been a complete pivot from a legacy pharma company to upstaffing in the technology domain, is that they'll create some pilots. They will rank and prioritize those by their return on investment or their projected NPV, and a few of those things will be sort of promoted and pursued, and they'll get larger and larger. And some of them even may exist for a little while. The challenge is when times are tough or volatile or uncertain, those things are usually the first to go because it's a lot of work to staff a tech company inside of a pharma company when that's not your core competency. So for the legacy companies, by and large, I see partnership driving the vast majority of where they're going to be sourcing their artificial intelligence from. They will have internal experts that will be the interface in order to make sure that everything kind of works smoothly and they understand what's going on. But that's pretty much the way that it'll play out for the legacy companies. There are a different breed of companies that have been formed over the past few years. I'd call them like tech-enabled pharma. These are the ones that have raised maybe $1 billion in a single round to basically jump from zero to large pharma, like Zera Therapeutics, I think, Formation Bio. Those are good examples where they're starting from the ground up with artificial intelligence as a core competency, and they're designing all their systems in a way that they can actually make use of that data. They will be different. They will be building the vast majority, if not all, of their technology in-house. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy in the industry that way.
Fascinating. Also, thinking about the future, could there be a time, or is human biology too complex to have an AI model accurately predict the efficacy and safety of a drug without a patient ever taking the therapy?
Actually, it's sort of interesting. There's if you're familiar with the organization ARPA-H, which is the health version of DARPA, which, if you're familiar with these sort of government entities, they're responsible for creating and sponsoring very forward-thinking technologies. So ARPA-H actually just announced a program called Catalyst, which is designed to do exactly that. They are very interested in creating in silico models that are capable of being as performant or more performant than animal models for preclinical safety and toxicity. So not science fiction anymore. It's being funded. It's being funded in a big way and bringing a lot of people to the table. Outside of that, there are plenty of companies that are interested in doing that as well. So I think we're well on our way there.
Incredible. I mean, think about if they could pull that off, or if like in 10 years from now, we don't have to use animal models, or we don't even have to go through a clinical trial.
Yeah, that's the promise. And one way or another, there's going to be a lot of value to be had in the meantime. It's such a long process as it is today. 7 to 10 years to bring something to full regulatory approval from the beginning of the process. So even shifting timelines by moderate amounts today save pharmaceutical companies millions and tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, and that also accelerates the path to actually getting into the hands of patients. So everybody really wins in the end.
So fast, such a fascinating topic. Like for instance, another thought I had was, pharmaceutical companies have tons of therapies that have been shelved. But sometimes a smaller company will buy that and try to launch it with this indication. Is there a way that predictive AI or any kind of version of AI can tell us, here are shelved products that could really be efficacious in this, with this disease state? Is that a futuristic thing?
Not at all. I think that's very near term, if not today. If we try to compare and contrast the two things we're talking about here, one, the preclinical sort of prediction of a new molecule and its safety or efficacy versus something that at that point has a reasonable amount of data behind it, but it was sort of abandoned, or it's a program that exists and they're just looking for new opportunities. It's actually a more tractable problem to be able to figure out what to do with a molecule that has existed for some period of time and has a body of information behind it that's probably significantly more than that preclinical molecule. So that has a lot of promise for a lot of things, and just making sure that no research and no drug really goes undiscovered for its use cases. Another thing there, and this was an ARPA-H funded project as well, but Every Cure is somebody who we've been working alongside with, and their task is to find every use for every FDA approved drug, because they feel and they have shown that many approved drugs have many other uses that simply aren't pursued for commercial purposes because it doesn't make sense. Companies lose too much money pursuing it. So now there is an entity who is tasked with that and funded to be able to do so.
That's so cool. Let's talk about BioPhy just a little bit. How do AI companies differentiate? Because a lot of people think AI is AI is AI.
That is a very good question. I often have to explain that when I talk with some of our partners and customers. And the one thing that I always try to make clear is to not buy something because it's got a shiny AI sticker on it. It's really more about what are the problems that you actually solve with it, as opposed to just selling hype and hot air. So I definitely encourage people first to think about what are you solving? What are the problems that you're creating value from? And as long as you're doing that, then you can kind of move on to understand the differentiation. Most of the time today, it comes down to innovation on a few dimensions. One, it's usually, can this model or this system offer me something that others cannot? The way that you differentiate there is usually in terms of the comprehensiveness or accuracy of the system. So when you see new models coming out in the news, that's usually these big ones from organizations like OpenAI or Anthropic, the so-called frontier models. Those are usually trying to push the boundaries of the comprehensiveness and accuracy that they can provide. Beyond that, there are things that people don't really think about. Like, those are great. You can create a proof of concept with nearly anything with those models, but people don't really think about the fact that it's cost prohibitive to do anything but a proof of concept because it's so expensive to run them at reasonable scale. And a lot of problems that have to be solved, you have to do a lot of computation for. So there's also innovation on these other dimensions around the speed and quality of the response too, which are often sort of overlooked, but super important when it comes to creating an actual viable product or business model.
Got it. So it's got to be, I mean, it's got to be hard when you're sitting across from a client trying to differentiate your AI from theirs. Does a lot of it just say, well, let me show you?
Showing is definitely the best way. Showing people, and oftentimes showing them with their own information, is the most impactful. If you're able to demonstrate the utility of the system with a partner's own data that they know intimately, and they can see if the system is providing at least, if not more, the same level of quality of analysis or output that they would themselves or whatever they're using. It's a pretty much an instantaneous, well, like, okay, I get it. There's not really a whole lot more to do after that, except for, creating the business case around how that creates value. And that's usually something that people address a bit beforehand. The other point that I'll make there is today, most of the time, that is the last comparison that you make. The first comparison you make is the AI system versus what the humans do today. That is often the first question, because that's the way we do things. It's the standard.
And is it just like night and day difference?
It can be. The way that I typically end up doing this is across a few dimensions. To simplify it, it's the speed, cost, and accuracy. And you can basically benchmark human performance, speed, and accuracy across all of those things on any task compared to whatever you happen to be doing. And it's usually pretty night and day, as long as you put some thought into the way that the system performs the task.
This episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. I want to spend some time talking about your career, because it's such a cool story. You had a great job at J&J. You spent 6 years there, but something within you spurred you to form an AI startup. Like, tell us a little bit of that story.
Yeah, and there's a good arc to it. The one thing that I will say is, oftentimes when people look at my background, they think everything was premeditated since high school or something like that, because it paints a really nice story. The reality is, each step of the way, I made the best decision I could for what my ultimate goals were. It's generally aimed in the same direction, which is why it looks continuous, but none of it was premeditated. So originally studied biochemical engineering and then went purely computational. Did my PhD in computational biophysics and machine learning. At the time, I was studying neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And this was sort of early on, where if you are familiar with Alzheimer's, there's a theory called the amyloid cascade hypothesis, which is basically a theory around how Alzheimer's manifests. So I was studying that, and that work bridged me into the biotech and pharma sector. I had done some work for pharmaceutical companies during the PhD and ended up at Johnson & Johnson. And the beginning of that time, I actually started out in a relatively traditional role. I was working with antibodies. And like anybody starting out at a company, I was learning the ropes and trying to understand the process, because pharma it's its own thing. You can't learn that process anywhere else except being there. What happened was I was tasked with doing a lot of traditional things. And because of the way that I think in my background, I was doing all of them the way that I thought it would be done best, which was with a lot more computers and math than people were used to for those tasks. So I got a little bit of a reputation, and I got to asked to be part of a group that was responsible for looking for opportunities to deploy machine learning and artificial intelligence in the company. So my mandate then was find the opportunities, figure out what to do, and create pilots and create value and scale them up. Very ambiguous, but it allowed me to really learn the business and be impactful in a lot of different areas of it. The largest thing that I ended up doing still exists today at J&J, by the count of my colleagues that are still there. And it ended up being a very large-scale program that looked at predicting and controlling manufacturing processes for many different molecule types, both internal and external manufacturers tied to Johnson & Johnson. So when you hit that scale of doing it across the entire company internally, but then also applying it to the external manufacturing network with a company like J&J, which is massive, you can get a lot of value generation from that, which is, in the, probably about $100 million in savings mark. So that combined with the delivery of the J&J COVID vaccine, which is about when I ultimately transitioned out, was where they were kind of the highlights from my time at Johnson & Johnson. The thing that happened, though, to your point, was part of the way through that, I went to Wharton to do my MBA. And my original intention was to stay at Johnson & Johnson and go down the executive route to try to make an impact in that exact area that I was working before. My goal was actually to create lights out manufacturing for Johnson & Johnson, because that was the area that I knew very well and I could make a really large impact for. The challenge was that, like many other people during COVID and during the MBA that I was doing, I kind of stepped back and took stock of my life and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do and what I was really passionate about. And as I reflected on my time at J&J, I realized that the thing that I enjoyed the most was being at the cutting edge, being involved in the creation of something and getting it to the point where it could make a big impact. The repetitive scaling and those sorts of things, that was less enjoyable for me. It's a necessary part of the process, but where I really got the motivation and passion was from that. And I realized that to be able to do that and to create the level of impact that I like to, I would have a much easier time doing that if I was outside the four walls of a large corporation. I loved my time at J&J, but I knew that I could make a larger impact by going out on my own and creating something that could be used by the industry as a whole. That way it's not just impacting a single company, but it could actually impact the industry. So that was a lot of the motivation. It's been quite a journey since. The difference between an early stage startup and a mega corporation is massive. The one thing that I will say there is, if anybody's thinking about that, as long as you have the stability to do so, it's worth it. You learn so much more, you grow so much more quickly, that it's a very unique experience.
Yeah, I mean, that had to be a huge life decision. In our pre-show meeting, you kind of simplified how you made that decision. Can you share that with us?
Yeah. So, yeah, and this might sound a little bit funny when I describe it, but apart from the passion and the motivation, a natural question for people is, when they're considering going out on their own or starting a business, is the financial impact. There's a lot of stability that comes with working a traditional, salaried 9-to-5 job. And it can be very difficult to leave that, especially if you have family obligations, you have things that you have to take care of. And like any good engineer, I sat down and I did the math. So what I realized, for me in particular, and this is unique to my situation, is that I live a pretty modest life. I don't spend a lot of money on things. I'm just a generally happy person with not a whole lot. I get energy out of what I do during the day and being with my family and those sorts of things. So my cost of living was quite low, and I had, like I said, I had saved quite a bit of money and realized that I certainly had the capacity to go and take the chance on myself for quite a few years if I had to. Ultimately, and I think the thing that you're alluding to is the end calculation that I came up with, which was when people project their retirement and things like that in the future. One, I realized that if I retired, the difference would probably be that I would just have a bit less money in the bank. And because I don't spend a whole lot anyway, I realized that doesn't actually matter a whole lot. I'll pretty much be able to live the same life anyway. The other piece of it is I also realized that I'm probably never going to retire. I know that may sound strange, but I realized that about myself a while ago. I'm just not the kind of person who can stop and, I would find other things to do, but I get a lot of joy out of solving hard problems, and I'll never step away from that. So I will probably always be doing something. And when I realized those things about myself, I knew that it was the right thing for me to be able to take a chance on.
Really cool. And talk about hard problems to solve. You're doing this at a time when being a vendor of the pharma industry is extremely challenging. Like, how have you had to adapt? How have you led your company through this?
Well, I think one of the things that we have done very well is we've operated in a very lean way. I know that there's a lot of companies in the space, and especially probably around the 2021 timeline, that maybe raised a lot of money, overhired, and had to lay off and do those sorts of things. We've never had to do that because we always try to keep a very close-knit team who's very on the same page about working towards the goal of the company. And because that, we've been able to maintain a good core group of people who's been able to push forward through some of these challenging times. The thing that's worked very well in our favor is one, the credibility of the team. You heard my background. I have very equally talented colleagues, and that always ensures that when we have conversations with our potential customers, that they feel comfortable with our level of expertise and knowledge. And frankly, although our system does amazing things, we don't oversell it. There's no three-ring circus when we do presentations. There's no crazy grand promises of solving every problem you're going to have. We're very direct and practical about what we do, and I think people appreciate that because it feels a lot less like you're being sold snake oil, and it's something that can actually create value in the near term, and they can see, touch, and feel it.
Unfortunately, Dave, that's all the time we have for the episode, but you've taught me so much. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. We're all going to keep a close eye on BioPhy. The website is biophy.ai, right?
That's right. I would probably expect some updates to that in the next 3 to 6 months as well.
Well, we're all rooting for BioPhy. We're rooting for you personally. And so on behalf of all in the Pharmaverse, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.